Chapter 23. The Mass Enslavement Tool. The very stability of our economy is threatened by any form of education that might change the nature of the human product schools turn out. The economy school children currently expect to live under and serve would not survive a generation of young people trained, for example, to think critically. This is a quote by John Taylor Gatto, author of Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. The mass enslavement tool that is used against us is the education system. Schools invite children to memorize for most tests exams without thinking about what they are learning, and they obey this style of so-called teaching without question. The ones that do question it are seen as disruptive influences on the rest of the young lambs that will someday become the next generation of sheep. Educating people, whether publicly or privately, is expensive, and we pay huge amounts of money in taxes to propel it forward, and this is done because the world's elite require that young impressionable children learn how to conform and fit in well with the other slaves to their system. I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think, as Socrates once said. Therefore, education of the young is really indoctrination substituted for education. Teachers talk at the students rather than with them because the teachers are just repeaters of biased information that is not necessarily accurate or true. The recycling of information is repeated throughout generations, and some of it has escaped scrutiny. Therefore, some of it is rubbish, and the information can be downright lies, particularly with the topics of history or religious education as an example. The education system, at least in the public rather than private schools, had created a functioning model that focuses on the storage of memories in order to churn out obedient workers into the system, just like a factory conveyor belt. The young, or at least the majority, because not all parents can afford private education for their offspring, are encouraged to conform at every step of the way. This situation is managed still further in the shape of school bullies that target other children that occasionally stand out from the supposed norm. The bullies are the norm's policemen or policewomen. Most kids spend their entire schooling trying to fit in and are commended for it. Through the Stanford Research Institute, the Tavistock Institute controls the National Education Association, which directly influences the public school system curriculum. This is a quote by J. Michael Thomas Hayes. The public school system attempts to filter out the creative or inquisitive natures of a child's being in order to prevent dissent against the system that rages all around them. Their worldwide system that affects each and every one of us does not want us to think for ourselves. We must be told what to think, when and for how long. The system called the New World Order doesn't really want its methods highlighted or questioned. It has been set up over so many years by so few so that the general public can be manipulated and controlled, therefore giving over all your power to the elite 1% of the population. You are to be good little slaves, obeying our commands through your governments like the sheep that we think that you are. I apologize for being blunt here, but the masses, including myself, are seen by the few as controllable sheep, and they are the sheepdogs rounding us up to control us. Really, they should be considered to be more like wolves. These words are difficult to say, as my grandmother was a primary school teacher in the UK for many years. The education programming machine is absolutely vital to the system because it is designed to implant perceptions of reality at the earliest stage to ensure that the mind fodder will either run the system as adults in accordance with the game plan, or they will be good little slaves for the rest of their lives while believing themselves to be free. This is a quote by David Icke. How fortunate for the leaders that the masses do not think. This is a quote by Adolf Hitler. Professor of English at Emory University, Mark Bauerlein, asks, why is it that the older the American students get, the worse they perform? he inevitably answers his own question, and it's because they are studying only a small percentage of the time and that the surrounding culture is to blame, even though students have access to more resource material than ever before. Bauerlein thinks that socializing, games and spending patterns are to blame for this. He thinks that the education of the young has been subverted by a culture of conformity, peer pressure and popular culture enhanced by technology, and I would include social media in that. The amount of youngsters that I see glued to their phones is now incredible. He believes that today's youngsters are mentally agile and culturally ignorant, and amazingly some take pride in this fact, and the fact that they have never read a book. The elite with their agendas of population control and the New World Order must be laughing their heads off at this. Their plans of wanting a dumbed-down education for kids leading to more vacuous people is obviously working on many of the young as well as some adults, unfortunately. Bauerlein goes on to say that today's rising generation thinks highly of its lesser traits. It wears anti-intellectualism on its sleeve, pronouncing book reading as an old-fashioned custom, and it snaps at people that rebukes them for it. Before an audience of students in 2004, he stated that you are 6 times more likely to know who the latest American Idol is than you are to know who the Speaker of the House is. The education system is not tailored to develop the multiple skills and unique gifts of the individual, but to turn every individual into part of a clueless, dumbed down mass which is just intelligent enough to be a slave but too stupid to see that they are. This is a quote by David Icke. Author Neil Postman sums up the scenario very well, because he sums it up exactly how I remember secondary school in England in the 1980s, and he said, now what is it that students do in the classroom? Well, mostly they just sit and listen to the teacher. Mostly they are required to believe in authorities, or at least pretend to such belief when they take tests. Mostly they are required to remember. They are almost never required to make observations, formulate definitions, or perform any intellectual operations that go beyond repeating what somebody else says is true. They are rarely encouraged to ask substantive questions. I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers. This is a quote by John D. Rockefeller, who created the General Education Board in the U.S. in 1903 to dispense Rockefeller funds to education. Education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils are thus schooled they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. This is a quote by Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Generally, more highly educated people, who have higher incomes, consume more resources than poorly educated people, who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education threatens sustainability. This is a quote from the United Nations Education for Sustainable Development Program.